You're listening to The Path with Brad Wetzler. This is episode 2 featuring Matthew Andrews.
All right. Welcome to The Path with Brad Wetzler, and I'm Brad Wetzler. I'm so happy to be here today. It's mid-March, and I'm in Boulder, Colorado this week. I split my time between Austin, Texas, now in Boulder, Colorado. And today I'm in Boulder, and I woke up to about 10 inches of snow, and we're expecting 10 inches more before this storm leaves us tomorrow. And well, it's a curveball here in the progression towards spring, because last night was daylight savings, and that always excites me that the days are getting longer. It stays dark or stays light later, and I start to get a little bit jazzed about the coming better weather. And well, not today. It's a major curveball, and I guess curveballs are part of life, and we've seen a lot of them in the last year. And with this pandemic, the pandemic seems to change, weekly, new variants. Sometimes the news is a little discouraging, and sometimes the isolation has been hard and discouraging. But I think hope is on the horizon. It seems like there is a path forward. And I think President Biden seems to have created a path for us, a path that was, through chaos, the chaos that was created in the last administration, and through the neglect of really taking this stuff seriously. So a path is a path through the chaos that we can sometimes find surrounding us and being a human being. It's a way to bring order to our lives when we lean on a path. And that's not to say that all paths need to be dogmatic either. I don't believe that, but a path is something to lean on, to travel on, and to help us move forward in our lives. And it reminds me of a story I wanted to tell today. I spent a lot of years working as an adventure writer, and I had the opportunity to travel around the world to some exotic places, meet exotic people. And one of the situations I found myself in years ago, I found myself in Oahu, the North Shore of Oahu in Hawaii, at a seaside bar with a man named Gene Savoy. And Gene was a dashing man in his 70s at the time. He had his hair slicked back. He was thin. He was chiseled. And he was articulate, and just, one of these people you meet who you realize is a true genius, really. Well, I sat down with Gene, and he told me stories of his exploration days in South America. Gene had been called by People magazine the real Indiana Jones, and some people actually say that Gene was the inspiration for the Indiana Jones movies. He was the guy who was spent all of his time searching for lost cities, lost civilizations, the ruins of them in the jungles of South America, and he would hire teams of men to help him, and they would hack their way through the jungle and in search of using ancient maps that he'd find in museums and libraries and sometimes buy on the black market or whatever. And he'd use these maps, and they'd go into the jungle for days and weeks and months. And he did discover, or rediscover, I guess is a much better word, but rediscovered these ancient, ruins, and some of them quite extensive. And he loved to go in and sort of find writings on walls and things, and tried to understand what they were saying. And his hope was to bring wisdom back to modern day civilization, the wisdom that these ancient civilizations had, and that he believed could be transformative for us all. And well, one time, so he told me this story where he and his team had been lost in the jungle for days, and they had not passed any landmarks that were familiar to his maps. They were worse and worse of it was that he was, at each time they moved forward, they would look behind them, and their path behind them would grow back in. So, they were screwed. And one morning he was drinking his coffee in his tent. He tells the story. He's he's dead now, but I still remember him telling this story. And, his ears perked up when he heard a ringing sound out throughout the jungle. And he ran out of his tent and he ran down to where his team of men were using machetes to hack their way through the forest in search of these lost cities. And he asked them, which one of you made that ringing sound? And he had then asked for the machete from that man. And he asked, where did the sound come from? And the man pointed to him. Well, Gene then took the machete and began hacking at the jungle himself. And after 3 or 4 swings, the ringing sound filled the jungle again, like a bell. And so he kept hacking at it. Then he asked all of his other men to start hacking in the same area. Well, eventually 3 or 4 stones emerged. And then it was clear, by midday that there was more than just a few stones, that there was a path here. And so they worked at it harder, and eventually it became obvious. This wasn't just a path. This was a road. It was a road built by the Incas. And he looked up at me to see, how I was tracking the story. And I was confused. And I think he knew that. And then I asked him, why was this so important? What does an ancient road give you when you're lost in the jungle? And he spoke to me like he was saying a koan. He said, Brad, a path goes someplace. Never forget that. Well, I chewed on that. I spent the next, week or two with Gene, sailing and doing other adventurous things with him in Hawaii. He was in the process in the mid-70s of sailing around the world in a homemade boat. And so, but anyway, after I went back home, after I left Hawaii, I chewed on this even more, and I couldn't really figure out. It seemed profound. It also seemed kind of banal or simple or something. I don't know. But then in my mid-40s, I reconnected with my yoga practice. I began practicing yoga around 1994 in Santa Fe, and I think I saw yoga then, like a lot of people who came to yoga in those days did. It was it was poses, it was exercise that made you feel good. You went home from a yoga class kind of feeling refreshed. And also it was a little window into spirituality. I was, not really open to spirituality at the time, but yoga kind of, gave me a taste of it that maybe part of me was missing since my kind of more youthful days when I was kind of quite a spiritual little kid. So, well, long story short, when I reconnected with yoga in my 40s, I went deeper into it this time, and I made it kind of a daily practice, and it began to show me things about myself that were new to me, or maybe things I just had lost touch with. But it took me deeper into myself. It began to show me, even the word God became interesting to me again. God is in the yoga texts. The ancient yoga texts, and it's not often talked about in a yoga class in America, but yoga means to yoke together wholeness. It means bringing wholeness to things, and the yogi idea of God is something it's a little bit different than the Western idea of God. It's more like the energy that flows through the universe, I think. And I became much more interested in this, and I found myself a couple of years ago. Looking on the internet for trips to India. I traveled there before on my own, but this time I was looking to learn about bhakti yoga, which is the path of devotion. And I'd just gotten interested in this other form of yoga that really wasn't about physical poses. And so I signed up for a trip, and I went to India with Matthew. Matthew runs Yoga Center Amherst, and he also, as part of that operation, runs these pilgrimages and trips to India, and he takes people to sacred sites, temples, and his hope and is that he can give the people that come on these trips these deep experiences that he had when he was younger, traveling across India, and these at a time that his life was changed by these travels in India and led him on his yoga path. So Well, I went on one trip with him, and then I came back. It was such a great trip. I went on a second trip with him, and first time to northern India and the Himalayan foothills, and the second time to southern India and Oroville and Arunachala, and both incredibly life-changing trips for me. But well, I got to know Matthew, and since then we've become friends, and I just feel like I wanted to share Matthew with those of you who listen to this podcast. He, for an American especially, he is a deep yogi, and he, as he will talk today, it was never really about the poses for him. It was always about this larger connection to something very, very deep inside him, and his journey. He has a lot to say about devotion. And that's a topic that really this is about today, is how can devotion change us? What is devotion? How can it bring us to more transformation in our lives? How can it help us serve others? And so I really look forward to exploring this topic with Matthew, because it's a topic that I think doesn't even get talked much about, and even in this country, unless maybe you're on some other very serious Christian path, perhaps, but devotion, holding oneself, bowing to something greater than yourself, and it's very against the grain, very rebellious in American culture, which is really devoted to success, achievement, chasing the dollar, chasing success, chasing material things. Our culture gets structured around that stuff, and sometimes in ways that aren't totally obvious. You have to really step back and see just how much time and of our attention is really poured forth into this chasing. And so I think it's a welcomed, important conversation, devotion, being devoted to something greater than yourself, and maybe even inspiring a little more humility in our lives. But that's enough from me. I want to let Matthew take us deeper into this subject. So my guest, a very special guest today, is Matthew Andrews. Matthew is the director of Yoga Center Amherst. He is an incredibly deep yogi, and he leads trips to India that you might want to explore yourself. And he's also a devotional singer-songwriter, and his music is on Spotify and other music services. So without further ado, I bring you Matthew Andrews on the path. Hey, Matthew, how you doing today?
Good. Nice to see you, Brad.
Good to see you. Well, thank you for being here. And as we talked a little bit off camera today about this podcast that I've begun, and the emphasis is on transformation. And I'm a believer that we can change, and but I'm curious about what other people's ideas of transformation, what they are, and also how it's done. And I'm also a big believer in storytelling. And so, I wanted you on today because you have an interesting story and an interesting path in life. You are a yoga teacher, but you're way more than that. You're a devotional singer. You're a leader of trips abroad to India that take people and introduce them to a more devotional understanding of yoga and of the ways that can serve a human being. And so I wanted to kind of introduce the listeners today to maybe the path of Bhakti Yoga, but I wanted to do it through your story. So I know a little bit about you. And we have traveled together. So place me in India, and you're 21 years old. You're there on a school trip. You're a student at UMass, and you travel to India to a place called Oroville to spend some time abroad, to learn something new about life. So start the story from there, if you would. How you found yoga and what it led you to.
I will just add that before I went to India, I was aware that people did stretchy thing. My girlfriend at the time in college would stretch and call it yoga, and so I had a sense of what postural yoga was, but I had never done it. I had never taken a postural yoga class or done anything like that. So when I arrived in India, It was just a study abroad trip to study this community called Oroville. It was a community, we were studying agriculture and community development and water purification systems and whatever, all these kind of aspects of this eco community. Oroville itself has a spiritual purpose, and the creators of Oroville, it grew out of Sri Aurobindo and the mother, who were yogis, Indian saints from the 20th century, and they described yoga as everything. Yoga is all of life. It encompasses every aspect of life. And so my first touch point with yoga was that, the understanding that this community and everything that it did was yoga. And
so if I can interrupt you, Matthew, could you land me in a specific room? Was it a yoga practice room? Was it a study or philosophy? Just land me in a specific place and time in Oroville. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's kind of Oroville as a whole, and then there's kind of the yoga practice space. It sounds like you're asking about like a postural yoga practice that I was engaged in Oroville.
I just want to know, where were you when you had the realization that this was something for you and something that had something for you that you needed to follow, a path that you needed to follow? And just walk me through maybe where that was and what you were thinking and who said it, whatever it was.
Yeah, yoga to me is like India. And I know that when I landed, it was my 21st birthday, and I got out of the airport, and it's like hot, it's in the middle of the night, it's muggy, and I just felt like I was being embraced by a mother. I felt like I was home in a way that I had never experienced before. And to me, there's something inherently yoga about that. You know, I arrived in Oroville, and then we did yoga practice. Like I said, we did postural yoga practice in a space with a teacher, and I hated it. And it was my least favorite part of the whole experience, was that, because I was stiff and I was a swimmer. I was competitive. I was like, oh, I can do, I like try to push myself to do the postures, and it just wasn't happening. I wasn't good at it, and it was frustrating. But the every day getting up and going and working in the forest and planting trees, that felt to me like yoga, and what I was being shown or taught through the kind of essence of Oroville was that is yoga. So I've always had this kind of dual experience of yoga, and it actually wasn't, I had a push-pull relationship with postural yoga for years, where I basically hated it and did it anyway, up until like 2014, 15, when my wife and I bought the Yoga Center Amherst, and I learned a different approach to yoga that brought me a little bit more into my body and into honoring my body as it is and practicing from that place rather than trying to impose something on it, some ideal.
So when you became home then from India, and talk to me about what happened next and how you went from being curious about yoga to being, really interested in it, and then led to becoming your life, I guess, and how it might have changed your life at the time.
Yeah, it's not very linear. I mean, I was so in love with Oroville, with India, with yoga philosophy, with the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and the texts of yoga. And I also had an experience of connection to the mother inspiration for Oroville that was immediate, loving, devotional. I loved her and I felt loved by her, and I had no context for what that was. It wasn't like I tried to make that happen or it was imposed on me from the outside. It just was there. There was pictures of this woman all over Oroville, and I was in love with her and she was in love with me. And then she stayed with me. I mean, I would like talk to her in my mind, and like, kind of like a figure. She felt like kind of like how you might think of an ancestor, I guess, like a grandmother or something, but bigger and vaster. And so I carried that with me, and I came back to the US and went back to college to finish college. And actually, my girlfriend ended up at a yoga immersion program in California, and so I followed her there. And again, it was kind of like, oh, great, this yoga stuff again. I'm not really, the postural thing, I'm not really into it. But I went there and kind of broke my body and ended up with my arm in a sling and like couldn't get out of bed, and through intensive yoga practice, postural yoga practice.
I just want to clarify for our listeners that the mother had passed away by the time you were there. You felt her presence, you saw her pictures everywhere and read her words. But she just entered your life in a way that was very meaningful and maybe even beyond metaphor. It was more real, it sounds like, in some way that we don't understand.
Exactly. It was just immediate. And she died in 1973 and I was there in 2001. So she'd been dead for 20 years.
Well, tell me, Matthew, then tell me what was going on in your life at the time that yoga was something that was welcomed to you, and how did it come into play as it sounds like maybe it had some healing effect and started to change you. Could you talk more about that?
Well, I can say that before I went to India, I was smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, drinking quite a bit. I had a pretty solid ecstasy binge a few months before, and I had been living that kind of a life, drinking a lot, smoking cigarettes and marijuana, and doing drugs, random drugs that I came in contact with. So there was a major transformation. I mean, basically, when I went to India, I stopped all that. Yeah. And not because I was like, I need to stop all that. It's just like, it was no longer appealing. It was no longer interesting. It wasn't really a struggle. I got a little sick from not smoking cigarettes. But there was such a dramatic change of scenery too, that I think that helped.
Looking back, do you understand maybe, in addiction terms or not to impose addiction, but, in terms of the pain underneath that was maybe causing these behaviors, and then maybe how yoga started to address the pain underneath that?
Yeah. I mean, there's no way I would have been drinking that much without some kind of existential pain. And the feeling of being home, it's not like it was all over. That's, I think, why I'm hesitating. It's not like snap. I spent the next 20 years of my life unraveling that pain. Mm. So there was a moment where a door was open and I was able to walk through it, and I was able to leave my past persona and my past kind of addictions. I mean, there's no doubt about that behind. And then I had to kind of integrate that, and that took a long time, and it's an ongoing process now. Yeah.
One of the things that interests me too about all this is just how much American Western culture isn't really supportive of, healing at times. And in fact, it actually wants us to be, drinking a lot and smoking a lot and buying a lot. And so, the path you started to take was a rebellious one, as I see it. And I think I see, even as someone who's practiced yoga since 1994 myself, the more deeper I go into it, the more I do see it as an act of rebellion, even as it's an act of wholeness and healing. And so, I guess I mentioned that, because it is an unsupportive environment we live in, and we have to take steps. So do you remember, we ever attempted to pull off the path? I know you became a successful businessman, and you began later in life then to kind of unravel again in a way. Can you talk about how yoga brought you back to yourself?
Yeah, well, interestingly, before, I remember a time when my now wife, we met in a class at UMass, my wife Corinne, and it was a class called The Ghosts That Haunt Us, and it was like a literature class. We read books and had to kind of talk about how they related to our lives. And I remember having an argument with the teacher where I was saying, I will never own land. I will never have a mortgage. I will never participate in this kind of dysfunctional society. So when you talk about rebelliousness, like that was the kind of space I was in. It was like, screw this. Everything's so broken. I was arrested before I went to India. I was arrested in Washington, D.C. at the WTO IMF protest. So that I was into that kind of protest, screw the system kind of thing. Ironically, as I got into what I call yoga and like moved away from self-destructive behaviors and into a self-nurture space, and a space where I'm exploring my pain instead of pushing it away and looking at my life. And I actually ended up going into a real job and started working at a nonprofit and, got a real job, bought a house, had kids. I mean, got the accoutrements of an ordinary life. But when I look back on it, it's like that was yoga happening. That was the shape that my path of yoga was taking, was into a more ordinary, which was rebellious against my previous, it doesn't look rebellious. The most rebellious thing you can do isn't like, get a job with a 401k and buy a house. But for me, it was radical because I was completely opposed to anything like that. And through all of that experience, so then I worked too hard and then I got super sick and ended up in the hospital and that kind of hit a wall through the kind of, American dream. I went the American dream route and pushed myself to the limits. And then it was after that postural yoga, like the yoga practice, the yoga asana practice, pranayama practice, and, movement practice came into my life and helped me get out of the hospital bed and back on my feet and into a more integrated, existence where it wasn't one or the other.
Well, eventually, I know a bit about your story. You eventually, started to lead trips abroad, and you brought, instead of having, these postural yoga trips abroad, there was some of that, but you wanted to introduce people to the things about yoga, or this grander idea of yoga that you held in your mind and body, and so you started taking people there, and you took people to sacred places, to temples, to temples honoring Shiva, Hanuman, Kali, all the different deities of Hinduism, and I've been on these places with you, and I've had incredible experiences there and life-changing ones. Can you talk about being in the presence of how, as a Westerner, these deities might speak to us and help change us, and I don't want to. I know there's some danger here about appropriation, and I want to be conscious of it. At the same time, I want to hear how you think about these deities, among other things.
Yeah, I mean, I have, just like when I arrived in India on the first day and it felt like home. There's a natural inclination that I have had toward Indian spirituality. When I hear the songs, when I see the statues and hear the stories, kind of am in that the smells of the temples, I feel very at home and comfortable and nourished. And, the thing that's been amazing on these trips is to go with people. So for me, myself, to go to a temple, it's a very deep experience. It's very profound. I don't experience the world one-dimensionally. I actually experience myself in connection and relationship with unseen beings all the time. And that relationship is one of reverence and honoring and love. And so when I go into a temple, it's a very rich, multidimensional experience. That's me. The honor of being able to, I've brought over 150 people to India from the US, mostly from the US, not all, some from Europe, and into different contexts, different environments, different places in the North and the South. And what I've experienced is giving people the opportunity to experience reverence. Reverence we think of in the West as like we're giving something away. But what I've seen so often is people starved for an experience of reverence. So when we walk into a temple, and I go, or myself and the other retreat leaders will go and kind of lay ourselves down on the ground in front of the statue and bow and honor and pray and worship. What I see in other people is like the permission that they lack in their lives to take on a stance of reverence and devotion and humility and honoring and to open to that, their own love going out and receiving something back. And that's the thing that's the most amazing about the honor of being able to put together these retreats, is creating a space that gives people permission to connect to their own devotion. Devotion isn't something that you like. It's not like a shirt that is something other than you, that's artificial or outside of you that you put on. Devotion is inside of each of us. And often it doesn't have room to grow and flourish in the environments that we're in the West. So,
can you talk a little more? So you're on to something I'm really interested in here, which is humility and devotion in terms of like holding ourselves, just acknowledging that there's much that's greater than ourselves. And I think in the West especially, we get really caught up in our importance and striving to be, the best at something, to be successful, to make money. And there is something really powerful, in fact, that I've learned from you on these trips about devotion and holding ourselves under whatever it is, I guess. And can you just deepen the conversation here around that idea?
It's funny the way you just put that. I think it's Swami Satchidananda would say, in order to understand something, you have to stand under it. And there's a kind of inherent, in order to understand anything, we have to have the humility to honor it, to have reverence for it. We live in such a fragmented society where, like you said, we're encouraged to kind of carve out our own kingdom and put up walls, and good fences make good neighbors and all that stuff. And it's very subtle. It's not, these messages come to us from all directions, all day, all the time. And what I experience in my own life is the richness of devotion, that when I allow myself space to practice devotion or experience devotion, I'm gaining so much. Devotion, humility, honoring, I get so much out of it. I gain so much from it. There's such like beauty and nourishment. My soul is fed. And I've actually had a hard time. One of the challenging things that I've had to go through over the years is going to India and feeling this like openness, like my heart has room to breathe. My soul has room to express itself. I can be my natural devotional self, and people don't look at me funny. They look at me like, why is this Westerner acting like this sometimes? But it's more like that's the normal, the normal vibe in those spaces. And then I come back here and it's like suffocating. It's like I can't breathe. There's no room. Like it's not even something like I can do something necessarily about it externally. It's just that it feels confining consciousness in the West.
For listeners who struggle with the word with God, with and especially Westerners who might not connect at all with Hindu deities. Is it necessary to have a conception, an idea of God in order to be devotional?
It's an interesting question. I am devoted to the sun, and I'm devoted to the earth. It's like in some ways we're just talking about the aggregate. I'm a part of the earth. I feel like the natural, organic response of a part to the whole that comprises it is devotion. It's not something contrived. It's not some conceptual idea. It's just what a tree is devoted to the forest. My liver is devoted to me. We think in terms of like, our minds are so fragmented and kind of intellectual that we lose the feeling state that's just pulsing through nature all the time. And so it's natural for me to be devoted to the earth, because the earth, as long as I experience myself as part of the earth, the natural response within me is to be devoted. And then we kind of zoom out from the earth, and you've got the galaxy, and then you've got the universe, and so we have this word God, but it's just the life of the cosmos. It's the pulsing, and we also think of ourselves, we've kind of been brainwashed to believe that we humans are this chance spark of consciousness amid a dead universe. A dead, stupid cosmos produced us, by chance. Whoops. Like, that's just so absurd. I don't even understand how it got through the gates. I mean, the reality is, if we tune into it, and if we there's a bandwidth, there's a frequency of intellectual thought that we're all often tuned into. But it's not the only bandwidth. It's not the only frequency. And if we just tune into a different frequency, there's so much there. There's so much information. There's so much connection there. And, the universe pulsing with life and intelligence, that's what God is. And so, the word gets, into, it can be triggering for people based on past experiences with dogma and fundamentalism. But rejecting the whole thing can be just as fundamentalist.
So you might encourage someone to try devotion, to try bowing to something greater, even if they struggle to know what that is.
Yeah, definitely. And, a child, when it starts to walk, falls down a lot. So the only way to develop, it's like a sense. It's like, you develop your sense of taste, and you develop your sense of vision, and you start to understand the world around you. In order to develop the sense of devotion, we have to be there. We have to go into our hearts. And what do I actually naturally feel connected to that's bigger than me? What's something that's already there, that's simple? Maybe it's my family. Maybe it's the community that I live in. Maybe it's the forest that's outside my house. It could be anything. But it's natural. That's the emphasis I'm putting, is like it's organic. It's not something imposed. It's not a concept. It's not something that comes from outside. So we just have to look inside. And if you look there, my experience is that it's like a blade of grass pushing up through the soil, and it will grow on its own. It'll develop and expand on its own without having to figure out where it's going or what it's going to be.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a quote I read recently by Robert Moore, I think, who was a Jungian teacher. And he was talking about the importance of sacrifice. And if you don't consciously sacrifice, he said, you will unconsciously sacrifice. And what he meant, I think, by that was we'd find other ways to depression, alcoholism, just unconsciousness, being in a zombie state. And so there's power in conscious sacrifice. Does that resonate with you at all?
Well, Dylan said you got to serve somebody, right? Yeah. You got to serve somebody. We're always sacrificing to somebody. It's not that if you don't consciously sacrifice, you have to. It's that we are a sacrifice. Mm-hmm. Our life is a sacrifice. The roots of yoga are in the Vedas. The Vedas are kind of the root textual container out of which the yoga tradition grew. And one of the central, or maybe the central theme of the Rig Veda is sacrifice as an archetype for all of existence. And they use the imagery of the fire, but it's like everything, every breath I take is a sacrifice. Every time I eat something and take it into my body and take it apart and derive nourishment and release, there's a sacrifice. Sacrifice means make sacred. First of all, the word itself means to make something sacred. But when we talk about, sacrifice in the sense of offering, self-offering, we are giving ourselves to this earth. Every word I say, every thought I think, I'm giving myself to the collective. I can't not do it. I can't cut myself off. I can think myself as cut off. I can imagine myself as cut off, but I can't actually cut myself off from the earth. You don't see people flying around in space. You don't see it. We are the earth, and everything that we do is an offering. And so I think that's where I go with that quote about whether, it's a conscious offering to something that we want to create, something beautiful, something harmonious, or whether it's just kind of sacrifice by virtue of what we're participating in. And if we're engaging in something self-destructive or destructive for the community, we're sacrificing to that.
Yeah, you bring up Bob Dylan, and another quote that comes up for me in this conversation is, if you're not busy being reborn, you're busy dying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I want to thank you for being here, Matthew. And Matthew is the director of Yoga Center Amherst, and I invite you to go to his website. What's your website?
Just yogacenteramherst.com.
And he offers trips, and I'm sure that he will, when COVID is over, he'll be resuming them. I shouldn't assume for you.
Yeah. We're looking at next spring, probably doing a trip in late February in South India, and then late March in North India. That's the probable.
Right.
We're all kind of waiting for the next shoe to drop here. It's vaccines.
Yeah. And we didn't really get to your devotional singing, and I know you created an album last year, and you're on Spotify. What's the name of the album?
Let It Open.
Let It Open. Well, I invite people to check that out and to check out Yoga Center Amherst. And again, thank you for being here. And it's just a joy to see your face again. And I look forward to being in your presence again at some point.
Yeah, likewise, Brad. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Wow. Was that not incredible? Thank you, Matthew. I always leave a conversation with Matthew. I guess the feeling that comes up for me is just sweet. It's just sweet. He always comes from the heart. He always comes from the soul. And it really touches a person to be, in connection with someone who is like that. And I think Matthew is very special in this way. And so I'm grateful for Matthew. And in our conversation today, I'm grateful for his wisdom about yoga, about transformation, and about devotion. And, a couple of things. I just love what he had to say about how being human is to be in devotion to something larger, to the whole. And it really gives me something to ponder this next week. And so, I hope you all are doing okay out there. Hope you're staying safe and well. I hope you're coming up soon to get your vaccines, and that we can all move forward out of this dark place of the pandemic and back into, our lives. And maybe we can use this experience in the pandemic to make some changes in our life, to maybe be a little less devoted to the American capitalism that we are in. No, I'm not saying reject it. I'm saying, it is our society. It brought us many, many, many positive things. And if we can bring awareness to how it's at play in our lives, and maybe just being more aware and being able to make better choices and staying on a good path and being on a path of service to others. So, wow, I'm looking out the window now. I think another 5 inches has fallen since I began this morning. So I'm going to grab my shovel and grab Tommy, my dog, and we're going to go out and shovel the walk. But thank you for being with me today here on this podcast. Thank you for being on the path, and I look forward to seeing you next time.